To my wife, she has no drive, no goals. She just gets to enjoy the fruits of my labor. Those were the words my husband Ethan chose to say into a microphone at the Gilded Room, in front of 30 of his most important colleagues, clients, and superiors. He held a champagne flute aloft, a broad smile plastered on his face, and the room erupted in laughter. I was seated just a few feet away wearing the charcoal gray dress I'd spent an hour selecting, the one that made me look like I belonged in his high-stakes corporate world. My hands were clasped neatly in my lap. I was not laughing. Before we go any further, I want to take a moment to thank you for listening and for valuing stories that need to be told. If you agree that the contributions we don't always see deserve to be recognized and that a person's dignity is non-negotiable, please think about subscribing. It costs nothing, and it helps ensure these narratives can find their way to more people who might need to hear them. Now let's get back to that night. 15 years. That's how long I'd spent meticulously constructing the invisible scaffolding that allowed Ethan Hayes to become the youngest senior vice president in the history of Sterling Financial. 15 years of burning the midnight oil, editing his pitch decks until they were flawless. 15 years of hosting elaborate dinner parties where I committed to memory which clients drank single malt scotch and which ones had fragile egos that required delicate handling. 15 years of my strategic insights that he passed off as his own brilliant ideas, of managing a household with such efficiency that it freed him up to work 80-hour weeks, of building the social networks he later boasted were a product of his own genius for relationships. And with one toast, in front of everyone who held sway over his career, he had just vaporized all of it. 15 years of his success, no drive, no goals, just enjoying the fruits of his labor. My name is Claire Hayes. This is the story of how I stopped being a ghost. But I have to go back. I have to show you how I became someone so easily dismissed, so thoroughly erased, that my own husband came to believe the fiction was fact. I need to take you through the 15 years that led to that microphone, that toast, and that single shattering moment when the world I had built for us came crashing down. It all started in small, almost unnoticeable ways, as these things so often do. When Ethan and I got married, I was 29 years old and had a flourishing career in corporate event planning. I was excellent at my job. I had a talent for reading people, for crafting experiences that made powerful clients feel seen and valued, for juggling the 1,000 tiny details that make an event exceptional instead of merely adequate. Ethan, at the time, was a junior analyst at Sterling Financial, with an ambition that burned far hotter than his job title suggested. He came home from his long hours completely drained, talking endlessly about the empire he was determined to build. Back then, we were a team, or so I truly believed. We discussed his work and my work with equal importance. We made our big decisions together. We divided the household chores in a way that felt like a true partnership. But when Ethan received his first big promotion, the one that had him traveling 3 weeks out of every month, the ground began to shift beneath our feet. We had a conversation that, on the surface, was all about practicality. Someone needed to be at home to manage the apartment, to make sure the bills were paid, to keep the fridge stocked and the closets full of clean clothes. I was earning a good salary, but Ethan's had just doubled, so it just made financial sense for me to temporarily step back from my career, temporarily stretched into 6 months. 6 months bled into a year, and a year quietly became permanent, so incrementally that I didn't even realize it was happening until the transition was complete. I told myself it was a strategic decision. Ethan's career had unstoppable momentum. Mine could be put on pause. We were building something together, and sometimes building together means one person has to secure the foundation while the other one climbs. My turn would come later. For now, I was investing in our shared future. But any investment requires a recognition of its value, and in my marriage, that recognition was fading so slowly that I didn't notice its absence until it was long gone. I became the person who knew the intricate details of Ethan's professional world without ever officially being a part of it. I learned that Michael Thompson, Ethan's boss, was a man who valued personal connection far more than professional polish. He had a daughter, Olivia, who was a competitive equestrian, and I discovered that if you asked about her latest show with genuine curiosity, Michael would talk for the better part of an hour and leave the conversation with a deep sense of warmth toward you. I made sure Ethan always asked about Olivia. I made sure he remembered details from their previous chats, so his questions sounded authentic and not like the strategic maneuvers they were. I learned that the Bridgewater account, one of Sterling Financial's most prized clients, was managed by a man named Daniel Kim, whose wife had a passion for antique jewelry. When we had the Kims over for dinner, I wore a vintage bracelet I'd inherited from my grandmother and made a point of telling its story. Mrs. Kim was fascinated, spending an hour asking about it, and by the end of the night, she was inviting me to an estate sale with her the next weekend. That single dinner resulted in Daniel Kim specifically requesting Ethan to oversee his next major portfolio review. I had turned our home into a strategic asset, but I never used that language, and I certainly never demanded any credit. The dinner parties I threw weren't just social gatherings. They were meticulously orchestrated events where Ethan's colleagues and clients could unwind, forge personal bonds, and lower their professional guards. I designed menus that were impressive, but never ostentatious. I guided conversations to ensure they flowed effortlessly, making sure no one ever felt left out or bored, and that every guest departed feeling they had spent an evening somewhere truly special, and that Ethan Hayes was a man worth knowing. And late at night, long after the last guest had left and the house was finally quiet, I would sit with Ethan at our dining room table and help him with his real work. He'd pull out his laptop and walk me through the presentations he was building for the board. I would read his proposals and identify where his arguments were thin, where his tone was too confrontational, or where he needed more data to back up his claims. I had a knack for anticipating how others would perceive his ideas, for knowing when he needed to soften his delivery or when he needed to be more assertive. He started to rely on my input for everything, every major pitch, every client proposal, every negotiation strategy. I'll never forget the night before his presentation on the Atlas acquisition, the $50 million deal that would ultimately catapult him to senior vice president. It was 2 a.m, and he called me in a full-blown panic from his hotel in Denver. The board wasn't buying his risk assessment. Michael Thompson thought he was over-promising on the potential upside. The entire deal was on the verge of collapsing. I got out of bed, fired up my laptop, and had him send me the presentation. I spent the next 3 hours completely deconstructing and then rebuilding his argument. I found the spots where his overconfidence had made him careless. I restructured his financial models to appear less risky to the firm's more conservative partners. I toned down his language in some places and amplified it in others. At 5 a.m, I sent him the revised deck. He called me back 20 minutes later, his voice thick with relief and gratitude. He told me I had saved him, that he had no idea what he would do without me, that I was the reason any of this was even possible. I remember feeling a warm glow of pride, believing with every fiber of my being that we were a team, that his success was our success, and that the foundation I was laying was crucial, even if my name never appeared on a single press release or company memo. I genuinely believed it. I believed it when I helped him prep for meetings. I believed it when I entertained his clients, laughed at their tired jokes, and made them feel like the most important people in the world. I believed it when I managed every single detail of our lives, so he could work 80-hour weeks without a single thought as to whether we had toilet paper or if the mortgage was paid. I believed it when I surrendered my own ambitions because his career had more momentum and a higher earning potential. I believed it right up until the moment he told a room full of people I had no drive, no goals, and was just living off his success. The afternoon of that fateful dinner, I spent an hour getting ready. I chose the charcoal gray dress because it was sophisticated without being ostentatious, perfectly suited to his corporate environment without looking like I was trying to compete in it. I applied my makeup with practiced care. I ran through my mental notes on which colleagues would be there, which clients needed a little extra attention, which topics of conversation to steer clear of, and which questions to ask. This was my routine, a ritual I had perfected over 15 years. Ethan came home that afternoon radiating an energy that told me the deal was done. His face was flushed, his tie was already loosened, and he had that look he always got after a major victory, like he had just conquered a small country and was expecting a parade. He told me Atlas had signed the papers that morning, $50 million. The youngest senior vice president in the history of Sterling Financial. He was bursting with pride and excitement, already preoccupied with the celebration dinner, with who would be in attendance, and what this meant for the next phase of his career. He gave me a quick, distracted kiss, his mind already a million miles away. I was proud of him. I truly was. I knew how hard he had fought for this acquisition. I knew because I had been in the trenches with him for every moment of self-doubt, every late-night revision, and every panicked call when he thought it was all about to implode. I had been his strategist, his editor, his confidant. I had rebuilt his arguments, refined his tone, and identified the weak points before his critics ever could. I had earned a piece of this celebration too, even if my name would never be mentioned. But standing there in our bedroom, holding that charcoal gray dress and watching Ethan furiously tap out messages on his phone, I felt a strange, quiet unease. It was a whisper beneath the pride and the anticipation, a faint voice telling me that I had become invisible in my own life, that my contributions were only valuable when Ethan needed them in the moment, and were promptly forgotten as soon as they had served their purpose. I pushed that whisper away. I'd been ignoring whispers like that for months, maybe even years. Little red flags that should have warned me the dynamics were shifting, but which I explained away because acknowledging them would have meant facing truths I wasn't ready to confront. Ethan had started introducing me at business events as just my wife instead of by my name. He'd started making casual, dismissive jokes about my lack of a formal career, comments that stung, but which I'd learned to laugh off to avoid being labeled as too sensitive. I had noticed him quietly restructuring our finances, shifting investments into accounts that were in his name alone. But when I'd asked about it, he'd waved it away as tax optimization, and I'd accepted it because I trusted him. He'd stopped asking for my opinion on work matters as often. He had stopped giving me any credit when clients raved about our dinner parties. He had stopped seeing me as anything more than the manager of his domestic life, the person who made sure everything ran smoothly so he could focus on what he considered important. I ignored all of it because I had 15 years invested in this partnership, and to admit that the partnership had become a one-sided arrangement would have meant admitting that those 15 years were a lie. It would have meant confronting the terrifying possibility that I had erased myself so slowly and so completely that even I was starting to believe I wasn't really contributing anything of value. But that night at the Gilded Room, standing before 30 people who held his professional life in their hands, Ethan made it impossible to ignore anymore. He turned 15 years of my unseen labor, my strategic counsel, and my genuine partnership into a punchline. No drive, no goals, just enjoying the fruits of his labor. And everyone laughed. The valet took our car, and Ethan placed a hand on the small of my back, guiding me toward the restaurant's entrance as if I were a piece of luggage that needed to be steered. From the outside, the gesture probably looked affectionate. To me, it felt like I was being managed. The restaurant was every bit as opulent as the photos Ethan had shown me. Crystal chandeliers dripped from a ceiling so high it felt like it could have its own weather system. The walls were swathed in a rich fabric that likely cost more per square foot than our monthly mortgage. Every surface gleamed with a polish that spoke of a full-time staff dedicated to maintaining its perfection. The other guests were already congregating, the men in dark, impeccably tailored suits, the women in dresses that whispered their expense rather than shouting it. I recognized most of them from past company functions. Michael Thompson, Ethan's boss, was by the bar, holding what I knew was a single malt scotch. His wife, Susan, stood beside him, her diamonds catching the light from the chandeliers and scattering it in sharp, brilliant bursts. The Bridgewater account team was there, including Daniel Kim and his wife, Grace, with whom I had bonded over antique jewelry at a dinner party I'd hosted 8 months prior. The junior partners were clustered near the entrance, their body language a clear indicator that they understood the evening's pecking order and their place at the bottom of it. Ethan was electric, more alive than I'd seen him in months. He moved through the room with a confidence that verged on ownership, shaking hands, clapping shoulders, and laughing at jokes that probably weren't funny, but served a necessary social function. I trailed a step behind him, smiling and nodding, playing the part I had perfected over 15 years of these events. Susan Thompson approached me first. She gave my dress a swift 3-second appraisal that took in every detail. Her smile was polite, but hollow. "Claire, how lovely to see you. That dress is charming. Very understated." Understated was her code for not expensive enough, but I had learned long ago that reacting to these tiny barbs only gave them power. I smiled back with equal emptiness. "Thank you, Susan. You look stunning, as always." She touched her necklace with a practiced, modest gesture and launched into a story about the charity auction where Michael had purchased it for her. I made the appropriate listening noises, my attention drifting across the room to Ethan. He was talking to Michael now, both men holding their drinks and standing in that specific posture of powerful men discussing important business. Michael said something, and Ethan let out a laugh that was a little too loud, the kind of laugh meant to signal agreement rather than genuine amusement. A woman appeared at my side. It was Priya Sharma, one of the few female colleagues at Ethan's level. She was younger than me, perhaps 35, with a sharp intelligence in her eyes, and none of the synthetic warmth projected by the other corporate spouses. Claire, right? We met briefly at the summer retreat. I remembered her. She had been genuinely kind, asking about my background in event planning instead of immediately writing me off as just someone's wife. Priya. Yes. How are you? Surviving, she said, her eyes sweeping the room with an expression that told me she found this whole charade as tiresome as I did. These dinners are always such a performance, everyone playing their corporate roles like we're in some ridiculously expensive stage play. Her candor was both startling and a breath of fresh air. I felt myself relax, just a fraction. It does feel a bit theatrical. That's a very diplomatic way of putting it, she said. She sipped her wine and watched Ethan and Michael across the room. Your husband is having quite a night. The Atlas deal was impressive. A very aggressive strategy, but it certainly paid off. That familiar flicker of pride ignited within me, mixed with something far more complicated. I wanted to tell her about the 3-hour overhaul at 2 a.m. I wanted to explain that the aggressive strategy had been my idea, that I was the one who had found the delicate balance between confidence and reassurance that had finally gotten the board to sign off. But saying that would have sounded like I was trying to steal Ethan's thunder. And at these events, women who did that were branded as bitter or delusional. He worked very hard for it, I said instead. Priya looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. It was something in her eyes that felt like recognition, or perhaps a flicker of sympathy. I'm sure he did. The dinner service began with the kind of seamless coordination that only a large, well-trained staff can achieve. We were led into a private dining room where a long, formal table had been set with more pieces of silverware than any single meal could possibly require. Place cards dictated our seating arrangement. I was positioned in the middle of the table, too far from Ethan to speak with him, but close enough to observe. Priya was seated across from me, which felt like a small blessing. The appetizers arrived, tiny architectural creations that looked like they had been assembled with tweezers. I finished mine in 2 bites and was immediately filled with regret for not savoring it, knowing the next course was at least 30 minutes away. The conversation eddied around the table in the predictable currents of a corporate dinner: market analysis, competitor strategies, industry forecasts. Personal victories were recounted with a strategic humility designed to sound modest while ensuring everyone understood the magnitude of the achievement. The men's voices dominated. The women smiled, nodded, and occasionally offered an observation polite enough to be acknowledged, but not substantial enough to interrupt the real business at hand. I had nothing to contribute, not because I lacked the knowledge or the opinions, but because to speak up would mean having to explain how I knew what I knew, and that explanation would have made Ethan deeply uncomfortable. So I remained silent, a spectator, feeling myself become more and more invisible with each passing course. Michael Thompson had barely registered my existence when he'd greeted Ethan earlier. He'd looked right past me as if I were part of the decor, his focus entirely on Ethan and the congratulations he was eager to bestow. It wasn't personal, I told myself. Michael simply didn't see people who were irrelevant to his professional world, and without a title or a position, I was irrelevant. But it felt personal. It felt like a confirmation of the unease I had been feeling for months, that I had become nothing more than Ethan's wife. A descriptor, not a person, an accessory occasionally useful for social functions, but fundamentally unimportant. The main course was served. The conversation droned on, and then Ethan stood up. The table fell silent instantly. 30 pairs of eyes turned to him with the focused attention that powerful men command when they choose to speak. Ethan raised his champagne flute, his smile radiating a confidence that looked natural because it had been practiced to perfection. I smiled too. In that moment, I was proud of him. Genuinely proud, despite the disquiet churning inside me. He had worked for this. We had worked for this, even if only one of us would ever be acknowledged. I braced myself for the standard speech. Gratitude for the team, a nod to their hard work and dedication. Maybe, if I was lucky, a vague mention of the support system that made his success possible. Some generic acknowledgement that behind every great man, there was someone holding everything together. Ethan began to speak, his voice carrying effortlessly across the room, full of practiced authority. I want to thank all of you for being here tonight to celebrate what has been an incredible journey. The Atlas acquisition represents not just a business victory, but a validation of our strategy, our persistence, and our vision. He paused for effect. People nodded. Michael raised his glass in a small gesture of approval. But I couldn't have done this alone. I've had a great deal of support along the way. My heart gave a small, hopeful leap. Maybe he was going to do it. Maybe he was going to acknowledge me after all. Maybe in front of all these people who mattered so much to him, he was going to recognize that our partnership meant something, that my contributions were real, even if they never appeared on a company document. Ethan turned toward me. He was still smiling. His eyes met mine, but there was something in his expression that made my stomach clench with a warning I didn't yet understand. I want to introduce you all to my wife, Claire. He gestured toward me as if presenting a piece of evidence. 30 heads swiveled in my direction. She has no drive, no goals. She just gets to enjoy the fruits of my labor while I do the real work. The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. My mind scrambled to process what I had just heard, desperately searching for an interpretation where those words meant something other than exactly what they meant. But there was no other interpretation. Ethan had just reduced 15 years of my invisible work, my strategic counsel, and our genuine partnership to a cheap joke. He had just declared to this entire room that I was worthless. Time warped, each second stretched into an eternity, yet everything was happening too fast. I watched the faces around the table shift through a series of reactions. First, confusion, then a flicker of uncertainty as they tried to gauge if this was a joke. Then, as they looked back at Ethan and saw him still smiling, still holding his glass as if he'd just delivered a witty one-liner, they decided it must be acceptable. The laughter began as a few nervous chuckles from those unsure if they were supposed to find this funny. Then it swelled, growing louder as more people joined in, gaining confidence from the crowd. Michael Thompson laughed the loudest, throwing his head back as if it were the most hilarious thing he'd heard all year. He even wiped a tear from his eye with his napkin. Around the table, people were laughing with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Some looked uncomfortable but laughed anyway, because not laughing would have been a social misstep. Others seemed genuinely amused, as if Ethan had just said something clever and insightful. I sat perfectly still, my hands still folded in my lap. I could feel my face doing something, but I had no idea what expression it was wearing. My throat was so tight I could barely draw a breath. Every eye in the room was now on me, waiting to see what I would do. Would I play along and prove I was a good sport? Would I dissolve into tears and confirm their suspicions that I was weak? Would I erupt in a fit of rage and give them a juicy story to gossip about tomorrow? Something inside me that had been bending for 15 years, accommodating, adjusting, shrinking itself to fit into the small space Ethan allotted for me, finally snapped. But it didn't snap into rage or tears. It snapped into a moment of absolute ice-cold clarity. I saw myself exactly as they saw me, invisible, unimportant, an extension of Ethan's identity. I saw the woman I had become, the one who accepted scraps of recognition and told herself it was a partnership, the one who apologized for taking up space, the one who had erased herself so completely that even her own husband now believed she was nothing. And in that moment of brutal clarity, I made a choice. I reached for my wine glass. The movement was slow and deliberate. My fingers closed around the stem and I lifted it, slowly enough that the nervous chatter around the table faltered and died out. The crystal caught the light. 30 faces turned back to me, their expressions a mixture of curiosity, discomfort, and morbid anticipation. I raised the glass until it was level with my eyes and looked directly at Ethan. His smile had frozen on his face, a flicker of uncertainty finally dawning in his eyes as he realized this wasn't part of his script. My voice, when it came, was steady and clear. Not loud, but it carried across the sudden, profound silence. Enjoy it. This is the last joke you'll ever make at my expense. I took a deliberate sip of the wine. It was an excellent vintage, probably costing more than a month's worth of my groceries, and I wasn't about to let it go to waste. I set the glass down with careful precision, the base making almost no sound against the tablecloth. Then I picked up my clutch, pushed my chair back, and stood up. The room was so quiet I could hear the rustle of fabric as people shifted uncomfortably. I smoothed down my dress, slung the strap of my clutch over my shoulder, and began to walk toward the exit. I wasn't running. I wasn't storming out. I was simply walking, with the kind of profound calm that comes only after you've finally made a decision you should have made years ago. I didn't look back at Ethan. I didn't acknowledge Michael Thompson or his wife or any of the colleagues who had laughed at my humiliation. I just walked. Through the dining room, past the other patrons who glanced up from their expensive meals, through the ornate lobby and out into the cool night air. Outside, I stopped beneath the building's elegant awning. My hands were shaking now, a flood of adrenaline making my fingers tremble and my heart hammer against my ribs. But beneath the tremor, there was a core of pure, unshakable certainty. I pulled out my phone and opened a new note. If I was going to dismantle the life I knew and build a new one, I would do it with strategy and precision, not with emotional chaos. I had spent 15 years applying that kind of planning to Ethan's career. Now it was time to apply it to my own. I typed 4 rules with the same methodical focus I once used to manage Ethan's schedule. Rule 1, do not answer his texts tonight, no matter what they say. Rule 2, document everything. Every single contribution, every sacrifice, every unseen hour. Rule 3, protect what is mine. Rule 4, never again mistake being supportive for being invisible. I read the rules twice, then opened a rideshare app. I requested a car to my sister Emily's apartment, the one place I knew I could think clearly, away from Ethan's influence. The car arrived in 7 minutes. I climbed into the back seat and gave the driver a small nod. He didn't try to make small talk, a kindness for which I was more grateful than he could ever know. As the city lights blurred past the window, I took the first deep, cleansing breath I'd taken in hours. Emily's apartment building was a modest 3-story walk-up in a neighborhood that valued character over opulence. I climbed the stairs to her second-floor unit and knocked softly. It was nearly 10 o'clock. She might already be in bed. But the door swung open almost immediately. Emily stood there in pajama pants and an old college sweatshirt, her hair in a messy bun. Her expression shifted from surprise to immediate, deep concern the moment she saw my face. She didn't ask what was wrong. She just stepped aside, pulled me into a hug, and closed the door behind us. She guided me to her worn, comfortable couch, went to the kitchen, and returned with a glass of water, which she pressed into my hands. "Drink," she said, sitting in the armchair she'd inherited from our grandmother. I drank. The cold water helped ground me. Emily waited with the quiet patience she'd perfected over years of teaching middle school, a patience that knew how to give people the space to find their words. "Ethan made a toast at the dinner," I said finally, my voice sounding distant and strange. In front of 30 people from his firm, he introduced me as his wife with no drive, no goals, just enjoying the fruits of his labor. Emily's expression remained calm, but her hands tightened on the arms of her chair. Everyone laughed, I continued, the words tumbling out now. His boss laughed the loudest, and I just sat there and realized he actually believes it. He genuinely thinks I've done nothing, that everything he is, he built all by himself. The dam broke. I told her everything. The years of gradual erasure, the way my contributions had been so systematically downplayed that even I had started to doubt my own value. I told her about the late nights editing his presentations, the client relationships I had single-handedly cultivated, the strategic advice he had passed off as his own. I told her about the financial changes I had noticed, but dismissed, the assets being moved into his name, the property deed from which I'd been quietly removed. My voice cracked several times, but I pushed on, needing to say it all out loud to someone who wouldn't tell me I was overreacting. Emily listened without a single interruption. When I finally ran out of words, exhausted and hollowed out, she leaned forward. Her voice was filled with a clarity that cut through my pain. "For 15 years, you've been his unpaid chief operating officer. Everything he's accomplished was built on an infrastructure you created and maintained. It's time to send him the invoice." The metaphor landed with a surprising force. She was right. I had been performing a high-level job with no title, no compensation, and no acknowledgement. I had convinced myself that love meant not keeping score. But what I had been calling partnership was, in fact, exploitation. I walked out, I said. I raised my glass, told him it was the last joke he'd ever make at my expense, and I just left. A fierce, proud smile spread across Emily's face. "Good. So, what are you going to do now?" I didn't have a complete plan yet, but I had the beginning of one. I'm going to make him understand exactly what he lost. I'm going to document every single thing I did for his career and make sure it gets recorded somewhere. He can't just erase it. Emily moved from her chair to the couch and put her arm around my shoulders. I leaned into her, soaking in the unconditional support. "You can stay here as long as you need," she said. "The guest room is all yours. We'll figure this out. Together." That night, lying awake in Emily's guest room, my mind raced. Around midnight, my phone began to buzz silently on the nightstand, the screen lighting up again and again. I picked it up and read the incoming messages from Ethan. "Ethan, 12 a.m. Where did you go? Why would you leave like that?" "Ethan, 12:15. M. You're overreacting. It was a joke. Everyone knew I was joking. Ethan, 12:30. M. This is ridiculous. You embarrassed me in front of my colleagues. Come home so we can discuss this like adults. Ethan, 1 a.m. I don't get why you're being so dramatic. You made a scene over nothing. Ethan, 1:45 a.m. You're being completely irrational. This is why people don't take you seriously. Ethan, 2:30 a.m. Fine, stay wherever you are. But this is childish, and you know it. The messages kept coming, escalating from confusion to irritation to outright anger. But it was the one that arrived at 3 a.m. that was the most telling. Ethan, 3 a.m. You're embarrassing me. My partners are asking questions I shouldn't have to answer about my own wife. This reflects badly on both of us. Come home and we'll figure out how to manage the damage you've caused. I read that message 3 times. My humiliation didn't matter, his embarrassment did. My absence was the problem. His public degradation of me was just a joke. The damage I had caused by leaving was the real issue, not the damage he had caused by negating 15 years of my life. That message told me everything I needed to know. I didn't reply. Instead, I forwarded the entire thread to my email address, creating the first entry in my new documentation project. Then I opened a new note and began to write. Every client I had nurtured, every presentation I had rebuilt, every dinner party that had led to a new business opportunity, every piece of strategic advice Ethan had claimed as his own. I wrote until my hands ached and the sky outside began to lighten. When Emily knocked on the door around 7, I had filled pages with detailed, dated, and specific examples of the work Ethan had erased. She brought me coffee and sat on the edge of the bed as I showed her. This is evidence, she said, scrolling through the lists on my phone. This is proof. You weren't just his wife. You were his partner in building that career. I need a lawyer, I said, the decision solidifying in my mind. I need someone who can help me make this official. Somewhere, he can't just dismiss it. Emily nodded. Do you know anyone? I thought of the corporate lawyers I'd met over the years, men who would undoubtedly side with Ethan. But then, I remembered one woman, Laura Bennett, a family law specialist I'd met at a firm retreat years ago. She'd given me her card and told me to call if I ever needed someone in my corner. I found her number and dialed before I could lose my nerve. It rang 4 times. Laura Bennett speaking. Laura, this is Claire Hayes. We met a few years ago at a Sterling Financial retreat. You told me to call if I ever needed help. I took a breath. I need help. There was a brief, knowing pause. I remember you, Claire, she said, her voice calm and unsurprised. Tell me what happened. We agreed to meet that afternoon at a place called Riverside Commons, a cafe I chose specifically because it was the antithesis of Ethan's world. The tables were scarred wood, the chairs were mismatched, and the concrete floor was unpolished. No one from Sterling Financial would ever be caught dead in here, which made it the perfect place for our conversation. Laura arrived on time carrying a worn leather portfolio. She was in her late 40s with dark hair pulled back practically and a blazer worn over jeans that looked both professional and approachable. She ordered a black coffee and sat across from me, exuding a presence that was both intimidating and deeply comforting. Tell me everything, she said, pulling out a tablet. Start with last night. I recounted the entire story, the dinner, the toast, my exit, Ethan's texts. Laura took notes without interrupting, her expression neutral but her focus absolute. When I finished, she looked at me directly. What do you actually want to achieve here, Claire? The question caught me off guard. I had been operating on pure instinct and wounded pride. I don't know, I said honestly. I just know I can't go back. That's a start, but it's not a strategy, Laura said, leaning forward. Do you want to reconcile? Do you want a divorce? Do you want financial compensation? Do you want to make him suffer? I need to know what outcome would feel like justice to you. I sat with her questions, allowing myself to truly consider what I wanted instead of just reacting to what had been done to me. The answer began to form as I spoke. I want recognition, I said slowly. I want an accounting of what I contributed. I want him to understand that I wasn't living off his success. I was actively building the foundation that made it possible. Laura nodded, typing on her tablet. That's actionable. Recognition means documentation. Accounting means financial analysis. Acknowledgement means creating a record that cannot be erased. She looked up. So we approach this strategically. First, we document every one of your contributions with concrete evidence. Second, we do a forensic analysis of your marital finances to see what assets exist and who controls them. And third, we identify points of leverage outside the legal system. What do you mean, outside the legal system? Courts are slow, expensive, and emotionally draining, Laura explained. Sometimes the most effective pressure comes from reputation. Your husband operates in a world where image is everything. If we can demonstrate that his professional success was built, in part, on your uncompensated labor, that creates a professional liability for his firm. That's a pressure point a lawsuit alone can't touch. The idea felt both brilliant and terrifying. But I had left safety behind when I walked out of that restaurant. What do I need to do? You're going to become an investigator, Laura said, turning her tablet toward me. I need emails, texts, calendar entries, witness statements if you can get them. I need a timeline of every social event you hosted and the business that resulted from it. Can you do that? I thought of the years of meticulous records I had kept to manage Ethan's life. Yes, I said, I can do that. Good. We also need to pull every financial record, bank statements, investment portfolios, property deeds, everything. I want to see exactly how money has moved in this marriage. The meeting lasted for 2 hours. I left with a clear list of tasks and a follow-up appointment. As Laura walked me to the door, she put a hand on my shoulder. Walking away took courage, Claire. Making sure you're treated fairly now takes a different kind of courage. You have both. The next 2 weeks were an obsession. I sat at Emily's dining table, my laptop a portal to the last 15 years of my life. I sifted through thousands of emails, creating folders organized by client and by date. I found the email thread with Daniel Kim of the Bridgewater account, where I had followed up after our dinner party to send his wife, Grace, information about the antique jewelry sale. Daniel had replied, thanking me for making his wife feel so welcome, and mentioning he was looking forward to working more closely with Ethan. That dinner had directly led to more business, but only Ethan's name was on the official account records. I found dozens of emails from clients thanking me personally for making company events feel so warm and inviting, several of whom explicitly stated that the personal connection I fostered was a key reason they trusted Ethan. None of this was recorded anywhere in his professional achievements. I unearthed the presentation files Ethan had sent me late at night with desperate pleas for help, complete with my tracked changes showing exactly what I had revised, strategic recommendations he'd later implemented, risk assessments I'd rephrased, financial projections I had restructured. I created a detailed timeline of every social event I had organized, noting the attendees and the positive business outcomes that followed within 6 months. The pattern was undeniable. My social and strategic labor directly correlated with Ethan's professional ascent. The financial discovery was even more damning. He had been systematically siphoning money for at least 18 months. Our joint checking account was drained to under $2,000, while a new account in his name alone showed deposits of over $80,000. The investment portfolio we had supposedly built together now had only his name on it. And when I checked the property records for our vacation home in Colorado, I discovered my name had been removed from the deed 8 months ago. I sat in Laura's office staring at the printouts, feeling sick to my stomach. "This is financial abuse, Claire," Laura said, her tone blunt. "He has been methodically preparing to cut you out financially. This wasn't an impulse, it was a plan." The evidence changed everything. I had held onto a sliver of hope that Ethan's toast was a single, terrible lapse in judgment. But the financial records showed a cold, calculated campaign to erase me. "What are our options?" I asked. Laura stacked the documents neatly. We can go through the courts, which will be long and messy, or we can create pressure through other channels that might get a resolution much faster. What kind of pressure? Your husband's firm values its reputation above all else, she said. If we show his employers that his success was built on your unpaid labor, especially work involving their clients, it raises serious ethical and legal questions for them. It creates a professional liability they can't ignore. I looked at the mountain of evidence we had compiled. The old Claire would have been horrified at the thought of involving Ethan's firm. But I was no longer that woman. I want him to understand there are consequences, I said. I want accountability. Laura smiled, the expression of a strategist who had just been given the green light. Then let's make sure he understands exactly what he lost the moment you walked out of that restaurant. Laura spent 3 days drafting a letter with the precision of a surgeon. We reviewed it twice, refining the language until every sentence carried maximum weight with a cool, professional tone. The final version was 3 pages long. The first page detailed my contributions to Ethan's career with specific examples, dates, and measurable outcomes, from the dinner where the Atlas acquisition was first mentioned to the 2 a.m. phone call where I saved the deal. It listed the client relationships I had managed, complete with email evidence. The second page laid out the financial evidence, the bank statements, the property records, the restructured portfolios. The third page contained our proposal, a formal financial settlement that accounted for both the equitable division of marital assets and compensation for the business development work I had performed without pay. The letter concluded with a 1-week deadline for Ethan to respond before we would be forced to make the information public through formal legal proceedings. It was addressed to Ethan, with copies sent to Michael Thompson and 2 other senior partners at Sterling Financial. We timed the delivery for 9 a.m. on a Thursday, right in the middle of their weekly executive leadership meeting. Then we waited. The call came at 10:15 a.m. I was with Laura at a coffee shop, my phone on the table between us. I saw Ethan's name and my hand shook as I answered. Laura gave me an encouraging nod. "Hello, Ethan. What the hell do you think you're doing?" His voice was a low, furious hiss. "You can't send letters like that to my firm. This is our private life, Claire. You've gone insane." I let the silence hang for 3 long seconds, just as Laura had coached me. "You made our marriage public when you used me as a punchline," I said, my voice level and calm. "I'm just providing the context they were missing." "Context?" he sputtered, anger giving way to panic. "You're trying to ruin my career over a joke. Michael is furious. The partners are asking questions. You're making me look like an idiot." "That's not my problem," I said, the words feeling powerful and clean. "You have 1 week to respond to the settlement proposal. After that, we proceed through formal channels. Claire, wait, we can talk about this. Just us, no lawyers, no letters. Come home, we can work this out." The irony was breathtaking, as if I was the one who needed to work things out. "The proposal is clear, Ethan. You have 1 week. I ended the call before he could argue further. My whole body was trembling, but beneath it was a bedrock of certainty. I had done the right thing. That evening, an unexpected email arrived from Priya Sharma, my colleague from the dinner. The subject was simple. "Thank you." The email read, "Claire, I hope you don't mind me reaching out. I heard through the grapevine about the letter you sent. I don't know the details, but I wanted to say that watching you walk out of that dinner with such quiet dignity was one of the most powerful things I have ever seen. I'm in a similar situation in my own marriage, constantly having my work minimized. Watching you refuse to accept that narrative made me realize I've been lying to myself. Would you ever be willing to meet for coffee? Not to talk about your situation, but to talk about how you found the strength to advocate for yourself. Either way, thank you for showing me what dignity looks like." I read the email 3 times. My act of personal rebellion had not been personal at all. Other women had been watching, and my refusal to be erased had given them courage. I replied immediately, suggesting we meet the following week. Over the next few days, Ethan tried every tactic in his playbook. Apologetic emails. "I'm so sorry, I never meant to hurt you," were followed by accusatory ones. "You're destroying my career over nothing." He called Emily, trying to get her to make me see reason. On Sunday evening, he showed up at her apartment, pleading through the door. Emily was unmoved. "If you want to communicate with Claire," she said firmly, "respond to her lawyer's letter. Otherwise, you need to leave before I call security." He eventually retreated. "He's scared, Claire," Emily told me later. "Not of losing you. He's scared of what happens to his career now that people know he took credit for your work." On Wednesday afternoon, Laura's phone rang. It was Michael Thompson. "Ms. Bennett," he said, his voice stripped of its usual bravado, "I'd like to discuss the matter raised in your letter. Would you and Mrs. Hayes be available to meet tomorrow afternoon?" The meeting was in a sterile conference room at a neutral hotel. Michael Thompson arrived alone, looking tired. He apologized immediately and sincerely for his behavior at the dinner. After receiving your letter, he said, "I did my own due diligence. I had no idea how instrumental you were in building and maintaining several of Ethan's most important client relationships." He looked at me, a flicker of what might have been shame in his eyes. "I spoke with Daniel Kim. He confirmed that the personal connection you fostered was a significant factor in his decision to increase his portfolio with us. That's not wifely duty, Claire. That's business development." He then laid out a proposal. It was a settlement agreement that was twofold. First, a full and equitable division of all marital assets that Ethan had tried to hide. And second, a substantial payment labeled Business Development Consulting Compensation, calculated at the rate the firm would have paid an external consultant for the work I had done over the past 5 years. The total sum took my breath away. It was more than I had earned in the last 3 years of my own career. The proposal also included a formal letter from Sterling Financial on firm letterhead, acknowledging my contributions, which I could use for my professional records. Finally, he outlined the consequences for Ethan. The promotion to senior vice president was rescinded. He would remain at his current level, be required to undergo mandatory executive coaching, and have his client-facing responsibilities reduced for 6 months. "He understands the alternative was termination," Michael said quietly. "I asked for one addition. The training you're implementing," I said. "I want to be involved in developing it. I want to have input on what gets taught about recognizing invisible labor." Michael looked surprised, then nodded. "Your perspective would be invaluable." The final signing took place the following week at Laura's office. Ethan arrived on time, looking gaunt and diminished. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out exhaustion. He sat across from me, his eyes fixed on my face. "Why are you doing this, Claire?" he asked, his voice quiet and genuinely confused. "You destroyed what we had when you decided I was invisible," I said, my voice calm and steady. "I'm just making sure the record is accurate before we close the books." "It was a joke," he said, the words lacking any conviction. "You meant exactly what you said," I replied. "And when my letter proved you wrong, you were more worried about your career than the harm you caused." For the first time, I saw something like real understanding in his eyes, not agreement, but the dawning recognition that this was final. His hand trembled as he signed the documents. As he set the pen down, he looked at me one last time. "I didn't know," he whispered. "I didn't realize it was work." The admission hung in the air. His ignorance was no longer my problem to solve. "I know," I said simply. After he left, Laura asked me how I was feeling. "Lighter," I said, surprised by how true it was. Like I just put down something incredibly heavy that I've been carrying for a very, very long time. 6 months later, my new apartment, once sparse, was filled with things that were mine. A dining table from a local craftsman, bookshelves I'd built with Emily, art that spoke to me. On that dining table sat my laptop, open to the business plan for Vance Strategic Partners. My consulting practice was thriving. I helped executives develop the very strategic relationship skills I had spent 15 years honing in the shadows. My first 3 clients were referrals from Ethan's former colleagues. The irony was not lost on me. I had developed a workshop that opened with my story: the dinner, the toast, the decision to walk away. The response was overwhelming. After every session, people lined up to share their own stories of invisible labor, of feeling essential yet expendable. My revenge was never about destroying Ethan. It was about reclaiming my own narrative. 10 months after that dinner, I was invited to deliver the keynote address at the Women's Leadership Summit. I stood on that stage in front of hundreds of women, and I told my story. I talked about how being supportive should never require being invisible, and how true partnership requires mutual recognition. The applause was a wave of validation that washed over me. Afterward, woman after woman came up to me, sharing how my story had given them the courage to advocate for themselves. That night, back in my apartment, I looked at the calendar on my laptop. It was full of consulting appointments, workshop bookings, speaking invitations, work I had chosen on terms I had set. On my wall hung a framed photo from the conference. Under it, I had written a single line: "Walked away, built better." Ethan thought his toast would get a laugh at my expense. What it did was give me the brutal clarity I needed to see who I was capable of becoming. The humiliation that was meant to put me in my place had instead shown me I deserved a different place entirely. The best revenge wasn't his suffering, it was my success. It wasn't destruction, it was construction. It was the quiet, profound satisfaction of knowing I had reclaimed every piece of myself he had tried to diminish. The last joke was on him, but every victory that followed was and would always be entirely mine. End of story.